Imagine a palace where every whisper carries the weight of secrets, where every child is born not simply as an heir, but as a living experiment in family pride. Picture towering marble halls, glittering with chandeliers, and behind the velvet curtains, faces marked by centuries of choices, choices meant to preserve power, but which came at a devastating cost. This is not a tale of fairy tale princesses or radiant queens. This is the story of women born into cages of gold, bound by the suffocating chains of purity, and consumed by the very bloodlines they were forced to protect. History remembers them not for their crowns, but for the curse that followed them, the curse of keeping the bloodline pure. For centuries, Europe's most powerful dynasties believed their strength lay in their blood. Kings and emperors clung to the idea that the only way to secure their throne was to ensure their families married only within their own circle, cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, aunt to nephew. Bonds meant for variety and vitality were instead twisted inward, over and over, generation after generation. What began as a strategy to preserve wealth and territory soon bred a quiet horror. Children who carried not only royal titles, but the heavy burden of fragile bodies and troubled minds. Among the most haunting stories are those of the women who had no choice but to bear these consequences. Born into power, yet denied freedom, they became symbols of dynastic ambition gone terribly wrong. To the outside world, they were princesses and queens adorned with jewels. But behind their portraits, carefully painted to hide imperfection, lay lives marked by illness, isolation, and tragedy. Their every breath seemed to echo the mistakes of their ancestors. Let us begin in Spain, where one royal dynasty became infamous for its obsession with bloodline purity, the House of Habsburg. This family's name is etched into history not for its victories on the battlefield, but for what became known as the Habsburg curse. For over 200 years, they married almost exclusively among themselves, creating a lineage that was powerful yet increasingly fragile. The men bore the most visible marks, famously elongated jaws, difficulty speaking, and minds clouded by inherited ailments. But it was the women who bore the quietest, most haunting tragedies. Take, for instance, Maria Anna of Spain. Born in the early 17th century, she was a daughter of King Philip III, destined to continue the great Habsburg legacy. Yet from her earliest days, Maria Anna carried the weight of generations. Her health was frail, her features marked by the distinctive Habsburg traits that painters softened but could never fully erase. When her marriage was arranged to her double first cousin, the Emperor Ferdinand III, there was no escape. To the world, it was a triumph of alliance. To Maria Anna, it was another step deeper into a labyrinth her family had built. Her children would inherit not just crowns, but the hidden weaknesses of a bloodline collapsing inward. And then there was Margaret Teresa, her daughter, immortalized in Diego Velázquez's painting Las Meninas. To the viewer, she seems radiant, a golden-haired child surrounded by attendants, the very picture of royal innocence. But behind the canvas was a story more chilling. Margaret Teresa was born into a family so tightly bound by intermarriage that her family tree formed a circle more than a branching lineage. As she grew, her body weakened, her health failing far earlier than expected. She died at just 21, her life cut short, her promise unfulfilled. She had been both princess and prisoner, her destiny sealed long before her first cry echoed through the halls of the Spanish court. And yet, Spain was not alone. Across Europe, from Vienna to Paris, the same story unfolded. Women born into dynasties found themselves trapped in arranged marriages to cousins and uncles, their fates tied not to love or freedom, but to calculations of politics and legacy. They became queens in name, but victims in reality, their lives shortened by frailty, their minds often tormented by inherited struggles. Each daughter was expected to continue the cycle, even as the cycle was visibly destroying them. The eerie part is not just the physical consequences, but the silence that surrounded these women. Court records rarely mention their pain. Portraits painted them as flawless. Official documents spoke of their marriages as glorious unions. And yet, behind closed doors, whispers carried the truth that each new bride was weaker than the last, each generation more burdened than the one before. It was as if the walls of palaces themselves had become complicit in hiding the cost of ambition. What makes their stories even more haunting is how ordinary they appeared to outsiders. The public would see a royal wedding, a gilded carriage rolling through cobblestone streets, crowds cheering, but no one saw the trembling hands beneath the silken gloves, or the eyes that revealed a deep exhaustion far beyond their years. No one spoke of the quiet funerals, the young queens laid to rest long before their time, their names soon forgotten, except in the margins of dynastic charts. And perhaps most chilling of all is this: these women were never asked. They were never given a choice. From the moment of their birth, their futures were decided. They would marry into their own bloodlines, continue the dynasty, and carry the burden without question. In their silence, we hear the echoes of history's darkest bargains, the sacrifice of human lives for the illusion of eternal power. But if you think this was merely a footnote in history, consider the legacy. Before we continue deeper into this labyrinth of cursed bloodlines, take a moment to reflect. These stories are not just about the past, they are about choices, ambition, and the hidden cost of power. If you find yourself drawn to these forgotten truths, to the shadows behind the crown, I invite you to join us on this journey. Subscribe so you don't miss the chapters that history tried to bury, the whispers that still haunt the corridors of time, because what comes next is even darker. For there is one woman whose very face became a symbol of centuries of inbreeding, a queen who carried the final echo of a dynasty collapsing under its own weight. Her name has been etched into history as both tragic and terrifying, and her story will show us, in chilling detail, the true cost of keeping bloodlines pure. Her name was Mariana of Austria, and she was destined to become one of the most tragic figures of the Habsburg dynasty. When she entered the Spanish court, she was barely a teenager, fragile, solemn, and already marked by the family features that artists tried desperately to soften with their brushes. Her jaw was heavy, her posture strained, and behind her eyes lingered a look of fatigue uncommon in someone so young. She was not only a queen, but also the niece of her husband, King Philip of Spain. This was the dynasty's design: power bound by blood, no matter the cost. The court celebrated her wedding as a triumph, the union of two branches of the same royal tree. But for Mariana, it was the beginning of a life steeped in sorrow. She bore the weight of expectation, the desperate hope that she would produce a strong heir to secure Spain's fading empire. Yet each birth was a trial, and each child seemed to carry not the promise of renewal, but the frailty of a lineage collapsing under its own legacy. One child in particular would become infamous, her son, Charles II of Spain. History remembers him as the Bewitched, a king so weakened by centuries of inbreeding that his body and mind were frail beyond measure. He struggled to walk, to speak, to rule, and his reign became a living symbol of his family's obsession with purity. But too often forgotten is Mariana herself, the woman who carried him, who endured the pain of his illnesses, and who bore the blame for his condition, though she had been given no choice in the path her life would take. Imagine the halls of the Spanish court during her reign. Tapestries lined the walls, gold and crimson banners fluttered, but beneath the splendor was a silence heavy with fear. Every noble knew the truth. The dynasty AS survival depended on a boy who could barely stand. Whispers followed Mariana wherever she went. Some accused her of witchcraft, others of weakness, but none dared to speak of the centuries of decisions that had led to this moment. She became a ghostly figure in her own lifetime, a queen wrapped not in honor, but in tragedy. Mariana's story, though harrowing, was not unique. Across Europe, women like her lived and died under the crushing weight of dynastic ambition. In France, in Austria, in countless courts, daughters were bartered as tools of alliance, their fates sealed by treaties and signatures rather than their own desires. Each of them carried the burden of ancestors who believed they could outwit time by binding bloodlines too tightly together. Each of them paid the price in their health, their happiness, and their shortened lives. And yet, history almost erased them. Their portraits remain, their names preserved in genealogies, but their suffering, silent, enduring, invisible, was pushed aside. It is only when we peer beneath the polished surfaces of history as golden palaces that we find their truth. These were not fairy tale queens. They were women trapped in a nightmare dressed as duty, a nightmare from which there was no escape. What makes their legacy even more unsettling is the way it lingers. We tend to think of history's horrors as distant, sealed in the past, but the cautionary tale of these women still resonates. It reminds us of what happens when ambition blinds those in power, when human lives are reduced to pawns in a greater game. The Habsburgs sought to preserve their bloodline, but in doing so, they destroyed it. Their dynasty crumbled, their empire weakened, and their story became a warning carved into the very fabric of European history. But pause and consider this. Behind every tale of dynastic collapse was a human life, a woman who might have dreamed of love, of freedom, of something beyond the cold embrace of duty. What did Margaret Theresa think as she gazed out from her chamber windows, knowing she was promised to a cousin she had never met? What did Mariana feel as she held her sickly son, watching him struggle to live under the crushing expectations of a kingdom? What silent prayers went unheard in the night as these women faced destinies chosen not by them, but for them? These questions are what give history its chilling humanity. These are not just names in a textbook, not just faces on a canvas. They are echoes, and their whispers still haunt us. And perhaps that is why their stories draw us in today. We are fascinated not by their crowns or their castles, but by the darkness that lingered behind them, because in their suffering we see the ultimate unraveling of power's illusions. No empire, no matter how mighty, can escape the consequences of its choices, and no throne, no matter how gilded, can protect those forced to live beneath its weight. When we tell these stories, we keep their memory alive. We acknowledge not only the grandeur of history, but its hidden shadows. And in those shadows, we find a warning that still matters, that the pursuit of control, when pushed too far, becomes its own undoing. Mariana of Austria died in 1696, her body worn by years of sorrow. Her son, Charles II, followed her only a few years later, the last of his line. With him, the Spanish Habsburg dynasty came to an end. 2 centuries of careful, deliberate intermarriage had not preserved their empire, it had destroyed it. The bloodline they sought to protect was gone, leaving only a legacy of tragedy and caution. And so, we are left with the haunting truth. The women of these dynasties, history's most inbred women, were not cursed by fate, but by the choices of those who came before them. Their lives were sacrifices upon the altar of ambition, and their stories remain as a reminder of how deeply human suffering can be buried beneath the glitter of crowns. As you reflect on their legacy, I ask you this: if you had been born into their world with no choice but to carry the weight of your family's ambition, what would you have done? Would you have accepted your role, or would you have sought a way to break free? Share your thoughts in the comments below, because in remembering these women, in speaking of their struggles, we give them something they never had in life: a voice, and perhaps through that, their whispers will no longer haunt the halls of history in silence.